Good morning, Kim Hammer, pastor of Saline Missionary Baptist Church down in Tull, located just outside Benton. Glad you're joining us for our morning devotion this morning. We're going to look at just the last few verses of the book of Genesis and finish up our time there. It talks about how that Joseph had stayed in Egypt for the remainder of his life, and he continued to be a valuable asset to the Pharaoh, which provided protection for his brothers and his father, who had come up from Canaan in order to join him during the time of famine. And we find that as it came close to the end of his life, that he called his brothers close to him, and he made them promise him an oath that when he died, that they would not leave his body in Egypt. And in reality, when you look at the last verse, it said, "So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, and he was placed in a coffin in Egypt." Well, that's where he remained, and his brothers didn't necessarily not finish the promise that they had made or the oath that they had taken to him, because when you get over to the book of Exodus chapter 1 and you start reading, you find out that they all died in Egypt before they had a chance to leave. They were settled in with their families, and this had become their new home. Not necessarily what God wanted for Israel. He actually only intended that they would go down there and stay long enough to get out from underneath the famine. But they had settled in there, and they had made that place their home at the time. And Joseph's bones were placed in a coffin, but it was not the final resting place. In fact, you go over to chapter 13 and verse 19 of the book of Exodus, you find that on the way out, after the 10 plagues that we're going to look at as we go through the book of Exodus, you find that one of the things they do is that they pick up the bones of Joseph to take them home with them. And so while it was that the brothers who made the oath, or took the oath to Joseph, were no longer alive, their descendants were, and they had an appreciation for who Joseph was. That kind of leads us into our next thought. When you take a look at the book of Exodus, in verses 1 and 2, you find listed all the sons of Jacob. We would refer to them as the tribes of Israel, because remember, Jacob's name had been changed to Israel, and these would be the 12 tribes of Israel as time would go on. And God had promised in verse 6 of the book of Exodus, he had made a promise that to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, that their people would become as numerous as the dust of the earth. And that promise had been fulfilled, or was being fulfilled, while they remained there in Egypt. For it said, "Now Joseph and all his brothers and all the generations died, but the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and exceedingly numerous, so that the land was full of them." You know, every time that God made a promise to Abraham, or he made a promise to Isaac, or he made a promise to Jacob, one of the consistent promises that he made to each one of them is that their descendants, their people, the nation of Israel, would become as numerous as the dust of the earth, or as the sands of the sea. And here in Egypt, we find that there's a groundswell from the inside out, because the Israelites are becoming so numerous that it led to a problem. Now, in the meantime, there's a new Pharaoh, a new king that comes on, and he doesn't know all about Joseph. Now, I don't know where he'd been. I don't know how he had been raised, that he wasn't aware of all the things that Joseph and his family had done and what a valuable asset they had become to Egypt. But for whatever reason, and I know what the reason is, Satan put hate in his heart toward the Israelites, because he felt threatened by them. In fact, that's what he says to his leadership, that they are more numerous than we are. And if there is ever a war to break out, they will fight against us from the inside out. And he had this perception that the Israelites were going to turn on them, although we don't have any indication that would show that they were going to do that. Yet in his mind, feeling threatened, that's the perception that he took. And as a result of it, he began to inflict hard labor upon the Israelites. Remember, the Israelites were brought into Egypt by way of Joseph to be slaves. I know that they came under their daddy's leadership when finally, Benjamin had been kept back, and finally Jacob and all of his sons and all their belongings came, and the Pharaoh at the time accepted them. But the reality is, if you look at how it originally started, they came as slaves to the Egyptians. They never really had their own land. They never had their own people. Even though Even though the Pharaoh gave them a land to graze their sheep, it was still Egyptian soil. And so they were converted into slaves. And this new Pharaoh, who had no sense of appreciation for what Joseph had done for them, subsequently what his brothers and dads had done for them, he disregarded all that. He didn't know about it, didn't want to know about it for that matter, and he made slaves out of them. And the thing is that the harder he made it on the Israelites, the Bible says the more productive they came. Not only productive in the work, but productive in having children as well. And so they grew more numerous. So it just goes to show you a principle that what Satan has intended to do to me in the way of evil, God has made it into good. And that's exactly what happened. Satan, by taking control of the Pharaoh's heart, inflicting pain upon the Israelites, intended to do them harm, intended to do away with them, but God turned around and he made a big blessing out of it. And that's what God will do for us today in our times of hardship. What Satan tries to do to us to harm us, God is going to take that under the value and the principle of Romans 8:28, and he is going to build it into a blessing for us. Now, as time goes on, we see that this new Pharaoh, this new king, calls the midwives, the Hebrew midwives, and there's two of them. They're actually mentioned by name. And he calls the first one is called Siphrah, and the second one is called Puah. And he calls these two midwives, who are Hebrews, and tells them, now when the Israelite women get ready to give birth, if it's a boy, you kill it. Now there's a couple mentions here I want to make notable. Number one, it's the third medical profession that we have. We had the nurse, we had the doctor, and now we've got the midwife. The third medical profession mentioned in the Bible is the midwife. The midwife who would help deliver the baby at the time that the mom was about to give birth. The second mention, that's not so honorable, but it's something I've got to mention. This is a first example of abortion in the Bible. Because when you look at what's trying to go on in the world today, abortion is no longer about trying to kill the baby in the womb. Abortion is about killing the baby as soon as it comes out of the womb. And that's exactly what this Pharaoh was trying to do. This was the first experience of abortion in humanity, in that he gave the order to the midwives, the medical professionals, that you are to kill that baby as soon as that baby comes out of the womb. That's nothing more than modern day abortion, and the premise for it and the mindset for it started all the way back in this Pharaoh, who Satan was controlling his thought process. I'll let you connect the dots and go from there. But what did these conscientious, God-fearing midwives do? Instead, what they did was they helped those babies not only get born, but then they helped them escape. They gave them love, and they gave them caring, and they took care of the mama. And so they did tell a little white lie, because when the Pharaoh came to him and said, well, how come it is that you're not killing these baby boys and they're still growing? And they said, well, the Hebrew wives are too fast for us. They have the babies before we get there, and then they're gone. You know, just kind of like mysteries, if you would. Well, the reality is, the Bible says that these medical professions, these midwives, they had a conscience, and it also specifically says they feared God, and they were going to have anything to do it. Today's application, I wish more people had a fear of God the way they did, because there'd be less heartache when it comes to babies being killed. So what did the Pharaoh do next? And this is where I want you to listen. What the Pharaoh did next was he issued the decree, and he said, all baby boys born that are identified, to go out and to kill them. And that's how it is that we got up to the case where we're going to read about Moses being put in the basket and placed in the river Nile. But what I want to share with you that I hope is troubling to your heart is that here is a man in control, in power, who told a medical professional, you kill that boy as soon as you see it's a boy. Just like they're trying to do today. And the next thing he did was, when he didn't win that battle, then he said, all right, go out and kill them all, kill all the baby boys, and be done with it. Tell you what, in the minds of people that do not respect the fact that life begins at conception, nothing is above what they're willing to do in order to get Satan's way. Let me say that again. Those who don't have a value and appreciation for life beginning at conception will go to any levels and any means to get Satan's way, and they're willing to be used by Satan in order to get it done. This king was not a good king. He was not a king of God, had no respect for God, and this was a king who was going to go to the furthest length to impose hardship on God's people. But the good news is, at the end of it, he gets his own. And just let me tell you that today, it will be the same way with people today. They will all stand before God someday. So may we live our life today knowing that today may be the day we stand before God. Have a great day.